In this story, it's important to break one illusion right from the start. The Order of the Solar Temple didn't just explode onto the scene. It wasn't a sudden cult with a crazy leader who appeared out of nowhere. It was a long-term project that matured over decades, in a culture where people felt educated, protected, and too smart to fall for anything. And that's exactly why it couldn't be stopped in time. My name is Stella. If, like me, you're fascinated by dark stories, unsolved cases, exploring cults, sects, fanatics, and maniacs, subscribe to my channel, leave a comment, and hit the like button. Now make yourself some fruit tea or a strong coffee because we're about to begin. Post-war Western Europe. In the 1950s to 1970s, it was being rebuilt, growing wealthier, and stabilizing. But along with comfort came another crisis. A crisis of meaning. The traditional church was losing its monopoly on morality, while the rational world offered no answer to the main question, why live if the future seems anxious, cold, and godless? In this gap, dozens of esoteric circles, pseudo-Masonic lodges, Neo-Templar orders, and spiritual schools began to sprout, promising what official religion could not, a sense of being chosen and a structure in which a person was no longer alone. It was in such an environment that the main architect of the future tragedy, Joseph Di Mambro, was formed. He was born on August 19, 1924, in France. Even long before the creation of the order, he was connected with various esoteric circles. Over time, his name began to be known not as a mystic, but as someone who knew how to build structures and keep people within a system. Later, biographical data directly emphasize he had experience in occult circles as well as legal troubles related to fraud. In other words, he was not a romantic visionary, but a mix of faith, roles, and manipulation. But Di Mambro had a weakness. He was not a natural, public, charismatic. He could manage the inner workings, create inner circles, build hierarchies. But he needed someone who could speak to an audience in a way that didn't make them feel threatened. And so, in this story, enters Luc Jouret, a Belgian homeopathic doctor born on October 18, 1947, who became the public face and main recruiter of the future order. Later reviews directly describe their relationship as classic. Di Mambro was the true leader, Jouret the outward image. Jouret didn't approach people as a sect, he spoke in a language the middle class loves. Health, discipline, ecology, the spiritual crisis of civilization, alternative medicine, the world is degrading, but there is a way. And here lies the key trap. People who attended such lectures did not consider themselves vulnerable. These were doctors, entrepreneurs, engineers, managers, people with money and status. It was precisely this social profile that would later become one of the shocks for the press and investigators. The members of the order did not fit the stereotype of easily manipulated outcasts. From there, everything proceeded not as recruitment, but as selection. And here the order operates subtly. Instead of pulling in just anyone, they create an atmosphere in which a person themselves asks to go deeper. Researchers who studied the history of the order describe the early period as a convergence of several Neo-Templar and esoteric circles. A network of clubs, lectures, and traditions where oaths and symbolism acted as psychological glue once you swore allegiance to a higher idea. You are no longer just a visitor, you are part of something older than yourself. Officially, the Order of the Solar Temple was founded in 1984. Geneva is mentioned as a key starting point, and it quickly established cells in French-speaking countries, particularly in Switzerland and Canada. The name was brilliant in its respectability. The temple referenced the Templar legend, and the sun to purification and transformation. It didn't sound like a cult, but rather like an order, a club, a school. Importantly, at this stage, everything could appear completely legal. registration, bank accounts, events, teachings. And inside they were gradually laying the main foundation. The world is divided into those who know and those who are asleep. It's a simple principle, but it's deadly effective because it forces a person to constantly prove that they're not one of those who are asleep. This is how a hierarchy is built without rankings and without IDs. Some understand more deeply, others are not ready yet. And most importantly, there's the fear of falling out of the circle of those who are ready. It works more powerfully than any threat. Next comes the second trap, the teaching about the end and the transition. In the order of death, it is not presented as death, it is presented as a transit, as a transition to another state, to another journey. And it is precisely this doctrine that will later become the key to the tragedy. In the years 1994 to 97, when a total of 74 people died in Switzerland, Canada, and France. But in the 1980s, this was not yet being discussed as a concrete plan. It sounded like a mystical horizon, like something that might happen someday. And that's precisely why it wasn't frightening. On the surface, the order looked like a sophisticated spiritual club for people who found ordinary religion boring. But beneath the surface, mechanisms were already at work that would later be described as a combination of psychological control, financial dependency, and stage signs. Researchers who documented this case pointed out directly that there was a certain logic within the internal life of the order. A logic of chosenness, of staged events, and gradually leading people to believe that they were on the verge of a unique event. And here is the most important part. At this stage, there is still no blood, no mass graves, no fires, no headlines. There are only ideas, symbols, discipline, and a sense. We know more. A person enters this as if it were a system of self-development, as if it were a circle of the enlightened. Like joining a spiritual elite, she thinks she is in control of the process. But in reality, the process has long been controlling her. Because any cult always begins the same way, not with violence, but with a phrase that sounds like a compliment. You're not like the others. You are ready. When the order already existed officially, with bank accounts, branches, seminars, and respectable people in the audience, the real work began. It was only just beginning. Because recruiting someone into such movements is not the hardest part. It's not as hard as making them stop believing that they are still free. And the Order of the Solar Temple did this not with a single blow, but with small, almost invisible steps that looked like growth, discipline, and maturity. The first hook was attractive and safe, lectures on health, ecology, and the spiritual crisis of civilization. Alternative medicine. You don't come as if to a cult, you come to reflect on life. The second hook is the people. Not fanatics, not outcasts. Just like you, with a job, a car, and education. The ability to speak properly. That's exactly what eased the anxiety. If there's normality here, then I'm safe. And then the selection process begins. Not recruitment, but selection specifically. They didn't drag you in by force. On the contrary, they created the feeling that you wanted to go further yourself. After the first meetings, they spoke to you in a special way, attentively, deeply, with the right pauses. They asked about your fears, resentments, disappointments, about what keeps you going in life and what eats away at you. Formally, it looked like spiritual conversations. In reality, it was profiling. The order very quickly understood where your weak spots were, where you were most hungry for meaning, where it hurt you the most. Then came the levels. They might not have been called levels out loud, but they existed as a system of access. At first, they only showed you what wouldn't scare you. Then came the symbols and ritual aesthetics, which made you not just a participant, but part of a tradition, supposedly with Templar roots. Then came the inner circles, where the main message was already voiced. The world isn't just bad, it's in its final phase. And only the prepared will survive the transition. And here it's very important, the transition was not presented as death, but as a transit, a shedding of the physical for the sake of another level of existence, with the image of Sirius as a symbolic station for souls. This vocabulary emerges as key precisely at the beginning of the 1990s. And this is no coincidence. This is the moment when ideas stop being philosophy and become instructions. And now about money. Because without money, such structures cannot survive. The order's financial loop tightened not through extortion, but through the logic of increasing access. For seminars, materials, trips, donations, the amounts gradually increased. At first, a person would invest a little, then more, then even more, and then even more still. And at some point, they simply couldn't stop, not because they were being held back, but because stopping would mean admitting, I gave years and money. For what? This psychological bankruptcy is the strongest cage, one without bars on the outside. At the same time, isolation was happening, but not through direct prohibition either. Relatives became outsiders, and friends were seen as those who hold you back. Criticism from the outside is not presented as an argument, but as a trait of a world that is degrading. They didn't tell the person, don't communicate with them. They told them, you've simply outgrown all of them. And that's the easiest way, when they sell you alienation disguised as personal growth. And this is where the GRU stepped in, their main weapon, staged evidence. The rituals of the order were constructed like a theater, which was meant to break the last healthy suspicion within you. Dimmed lights, symbols, a precise script, the right words, and at the climax something happens. A voice appears, a sign, a light, a presence. Researchers later described these phenomena as controlled effects that reinforced faith in the masters and in the supernatural. It is precisely this materialization of mysticism that makes a person obedient, because they no longer argue with the idea. They argue with what they believe they have seen with their own eyes. Within this system, there was another kind of cement, the cosmic family. The order not only gave people meaning, it redistributed their connections, teaching about cosmic pairs, compatibility, and destiny. This allowed leaders to interfere in relationships, break up marriages, and form new unions under the guise of a higher will. The story of the cosmic child Emmanuel became an especially powerful symbol, elevated within the movement to a unique status as a sign of the new faith, as a sign of a new era. This created the sense that they were not just a group, but an incubator for the future of humanity. But any such construct has a weak spot. If people start to see the mechanism, faith crumbles. And for the order, this weak spot turned out to be the performances themselves. People who knew how the signs worked became more dangerous than journalists or the police. In materials about the tragedy, the role of people connected to the technical side of the rituals is repeatedly emphasized. And the threat of exposing the effects fueled the leadership's paranoia and the radicalization of the transition. Next is the factor that finally shifted the order from a rhetorical club to a state of siege: the weapons scandal in Canada in 1993. This was the moment when the movement felt that it was being seen as a threat not only spiritually but also legally. After this, according to descriptions, paranoia grew and there was talk of conspiracy, persecution, and attacks by the system. And the transition began to sound like a response to a world that was coming after them. Even the fact that the Canadian press received materials from police wiretaps and began calling them a doomsday cult was important, not as a sensation, but as a signal. The outside world stopped being just a backdrop. It became the enemy. And now you can see the full trap. A person wasn't taken away immediately. First, they taught her to think that she was chosen. Then they gave her symbols and rituals, which reinforced that feeling. Then they tied her financially and distanced her from outside voices, showed her evidence of the supernatural, convinced her that doubt was not reason, but fear. And in the end, they led her to the main point. The world is perishing, and there is only one way out. And when the first deaths began in 1994, for some people it no longer looked like death. It looked like the completion of a scenario they had been prepared for over the years. In the early 90s, within the Order of the Solar Temple, the same thing happened that always happens to such organizations when they go too far. An idea that for years existed as a symbol, as a poetic metaphor, as something for someday, not now, suddenly begins to lose its flexibility. It stops being a horizon and becomes a deadline. Joseph Di Mambro no longer speaks of a possible transition. He speaks of a necessary one, an inevitable one, saying that the world is not just sick, it is doomed, and that the order can no longer wait. This is a crucial turning point when the leader stops seeing time as a resource and starts seeing it as a threat. The cult enters a phase of radicalization. At the same time, the external security perimeter is also breaking down. In 1993, the Canadian police conducted a search of a house connected to the order. There, they found weapons, ammunition, financial documents, and ritual materials. Formally, nothing that would immediately warrant banning the organization. But for the inner circle, this is already a signal. Not a legal one, the existential world has noticed. And so, according to the cult's logic, it has begun its attack. It is from this moment that the word sacrifice starts to appear in conversations, a word that was previously used cautiously, almost philosophically. Not as suffering, but as a function, as an essential element of transition. And this is where the most dangerous thing happens. Some people are no longer told everything. Within the order, a rigid core is formed, those who are ready, and the periphery, those who are still being led. Luc Jouret continues to serve as the public face during this period. He speaks calmly, confidently, and persuasively. For many, his voice remains a guarantee that everything is under control. But the actual decisions are made by Joseph Di Mambro. At this point, his world is already completely closed off. He is convinced that the order is surrounded by enemies, that betrayal is possible from within, and that any doubt is a crack through which the system could collapse. A quiet filtering begins inside. People who ask too many questions are not expelled. Instead, they are cooled off, pushed aside, and not allowed to advance to new stages. Gradually, they are made to understand that they could become an obstacle. And in the logic of a cult, an obstacle is a danger to everyone. In October 1994, the transition stops being just a theory. On the night of October 4th to 5th in Switzerland, in the canton of Fribourg, firefighters discover a burned house. Inside are the bodies of the order's members. They are not lying chaotically, they are arranged, dressed in ritual robes. Symbols are placed nearby. This doesn't look like panic, it looks like a scenario carried out as planned. Almost simultaneously, a similar scene is found in Salvan, canton of Valais. Again, a fire, again bodies, again. There are no signs of struggle that would indicate a classic case of mass killing. The police aren't saying it out loud yet, but doubt has already arisen. A few days later, information comes in from Canada, Quebec. 2 different locations, the bodies of the order's members. Enclosed spaces, signs of preparation. It becomes clear, this is not a local breakdown, this is a coordinated action. In total, in October 1994, 53 people died, including children. And it is here that the official version of voluntary mass suicide begins to fall apart. Forensic medical experts determined not all of the deceased were fully conscious. In some cases, traces of sedative substances were found. In others, there were characteristic injuries that do not fit a voluntary scenario. In other words, the decision was not the same for everyone. Luc Jouret and Joseph Di Mambro died together with the others. But this did not stop the process. In 1995, in France, in the Haute-Savoie department, another 16 bodies were found. The scenario repeats itself. Symbolism, ritual order, an enclosed space, and again the logic of transition. The people who remained could no longer exist outside this system. For them, the world beyond the order was not just hostile, it was unlivable. The final act takes place in 1997. The final full stop. the total number of victims is 74 people. The international investigation conducted by Switzerland, France, and Canada agreed on one thing: the Order of the Solar Temple. It was not a religious movement in the classical sense. It was a hierarchical, closed system of psychological control that over the years narrowed the range of possible choices for its members. By the time of the transition, for many, there simply was no alternative. This is the key conclusion of the experts. It sounds cold and terrifying. Most of the victims did not make their decision in a state of freedom. Their choice was the result of years of indoctrination, financial dependence, emotional isolation, and an imposed worldview in which death no longer appeared to be death. That is why this story cannot be explained by the phrase, "they made this decision themselves," because by yourself means you have somewhere else to go. And in the Order of the Solar Temple, that option was taken away from them long before the fires. After the tragedy, France created special agencies to study destructive cults. Switzerland tightens its control over similar organizations. The order becomes one of the key cases in European criminology and the psychology of influence. But the main lesson of this story is neither legal nor religious. It's about the fact that you don't need to put a person in chains to break them. It's enough to give them an idea that gradually changes their reality. A community that becomes the only source of meaning, and the fear of being left alone with a world that for years has been described to you as hostile and empty. That's why the story of the Order of the Solar Temple doesn't feel like something from the past. It feels like an instruction manual that was simply read too late. And if it frightens you, it means it still works. Thank you so much for walking this path with me. I hope we'll meet again in the next video. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones. So goodbye.